Hello and welcome to the World Deciphered, brought to you by the Cipher Brief. I'm your host, Suzanne Kelly. In this week's episode, we're looking at how Tehran is positioning itself to test the Trump administration on everything from its support to proxies in the Middle East to its quest for a nuclear weapon. We're talking with Norm Roule, former National Intelligence Manager for Iran at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, about what the next 4 years will look like for Tehran with President Trump back in office.
In fact, I think it's possible to say right now that Iran has already initiated its playbook for sanctions relief and negotiations. We have seen Europe and Iran engage in talks. This isn't a surprise. This is actually the third time in the last 20 years that Iran has confronted a very similar set of circumstances.
We're looking forward to that extended conversation with Norm Roule coming up. But first, let's check in with Cipher Brief Managing Editor Tom Nagorski for a look at what's happening around the world at thecipherbrief.com. Tom?
Suzanne, we start this week with 2 ceasefire deals in the Middle East. One is holding, the other is looking more fragile by the day. In Gaza, remarkable scenes as tens of thousands of Palestinians are making the long trek north, a journey that is possible now because of the ceasefire deal there. They're heading back to see what, if anything, is left of their homes in northern Gaza. For now, this highly complex deal is holding, allowing them to make that journey. Aid is coming in, although the needs are great, of course, because the damage is just staggering. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, that ceasefire arrangement looks to be hanging by a thread. The issue there is that Israeli troops have stayed on in southern Lebanon, claiming that Hezbollah forces hadn't left and that the Lebanese army hadn't deployed quickly enough to the region. Protests have erupted in the south over the continued Israeli presence. Israeli forces have killed several protesters, and now the U.S. and Lebanon have announced that the deadline for the Israeli withdrawal has been extended to the 18th of February. We go next to the bottom of the Baltic Sea, where we have more trouble there to report. Another undersea cable has been damaged in what Swedish authorities have called, quote, gross sabotage, unquote. We've seen several incidents of this recently, undersea cable damage, not always clear what's an accident, what is sabotage. This time it was a cable running between Sweden and Latvia. Also significant, NATO member nations deployed vessels to the site, marking the alliance's first coordinated response to this suspected undersea sabotage campaign. They found 3 Russian cargo vessels in the area. Crews on all 3 are being questioned. This kind of sabotage falls squarely into that gray zone between peace and outright conflict. And the gray zone is a subject that the Cipher Brief has been focusing on a lot lately. It's a tool that many see in the arsenal of the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin. Which brings us, Suzanne, to our final item. Should Donald Trump meet with Vladimir Putin? The White House says a meeting is in the works as part of its plan to end the war in Ukraine. There's no word on when or where. Several Cipher Brief experts have weighed in on the wisdom of meeting with Trump at the moment. The most common response we've heard, it might be a good idea, but get some meaningful concessions from the Kremlin first. Much more at thecipherbrief.com. Back to you, Suzanne.
Thanks very much for that, Tom. Well, President Trump has made it more than clear that among his top foreign policy priorities is to broker a deal to bring about an end to Russia's war in Ukraine. While the clock is ticking on the administration's 100-day plan, the world is still waiting to see whether a direct meeting between the leaders of both countries will happen. The Cipher Brief spoke this week with former Ukrainian Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who is not in the same political party as Ukrainian Prime Minister Volodymyr Zelensky, to get his perspective on the prospects of a deal that Ukraine can live with.
Let me start with the message that my gut feeling is that everyone right now in the world, in the free world, heavily relies on President Trump. And it's up to him to decide the future of Ukraine, the future of the global order, and the future strong or weak United States. And I believe that he has a huge ammo and huge arsenal in his hands as the president to restore the global order and to help Ukraine to survive in this unjust war. And actually to help an entire European Union to survive and to stop autocrats and dictators like Putin, like Kim Jong-un, those who are right now sitting under the umbrella of China, to stop their neo-imperialistic ambitions. So that's the main point. The second issue, what is needed? We need a clear-cut, credible, and implementable plan. How to stop the war, and how to restore the global order, and how to make Ukraine a prosperous country with European Union membership, not just prospective, but membership, and NATO membership. And I want to be very clear, Article 5 is the only solution for Ukraine how to secure its future. This is the only ironclad guarantees. Whether it's a good idea for President Trump to meet with the war criminal Putin, I am not in the position to lecture the new administration or the new president. It's up to the president to decide whether he wants to bring the isolation that Putin is in right now. And my guess and my take is that this kind of meeting is possible, but only in case if President Trump gets real deliverables out of these meetings, very strong deliverables. When President Trump at the press conference after the meeting, which is to be only held by the president without war criminal Putin, is to announce that he has reached a historic deal to save Ukraine, that he forced Russia for the ceasefire, and that actually Ukraine has restored its territorial integrity and got an ironclad security guarantees from the United States. And the United States have shown its strength all over the world.
That was former Ukrainian Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk in a conversation this week with Cipher Brief managing editor Tom Nagorski. You can find their full conversation on the Cipher Brief's YouTube channel. Well, to Iran now, and what may end up being one of the trickier foreign policy challenges facing the Trump administration. Last week, Iranian Vice President Javad Zarif took the stage in Davos, delivering remarks that appeared to be an effort to rebrand Tehran on the international stage. We spoke with a former chief of operations in the Iran Operations Division at CIA, Paula Doyle, for her take on the speech and what it could mean as Iran considers how it's going to deal with the next Trump administration.
This is a man that has been part of the negotiating world of Iran for many, many years. And he has also been in and out of power, re-stressing that, the worst day that could happen for him is to go back to university and teach. I think if you listen to him and again, peel away the stuff about how successful Iran is and how powerful it's been in defending the rights of Palestinian statehood. He has tried to reframe Iran's relationships in the region. I don't think he did a very persuasive job. He tried to reframe the success of Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis in a couple of different ways by saying, oh, they have their own agency, they're doing what they need to do to protect their missions, and they're not working at our behest. Of course, that's false. But he also tried to reframe, we are tough, we are strong, we are resilient, we will continue to pay in blood, sweat, tears, and money. So there were, when I look at that, I see an Iranian official that the supreme leader clearly let leave Iran to try to reframe a very weak Iran, and an economy that is crushed. My expat friends who fly back and forth to Iran pretty regularly tell me that there are brownouts all around the country. The youth are doing what they want to do when they want to do it. The religious police seem to have lost their, not their power. They still are an instrument of power. They have guns, they have brutality, but they don't seem to be using it. Even in Qom and Mashhad, which are pretty religious, conservative, pious centers. So there's this, I believe there's an attempt by Iran to reframe how it sees itself in the world. And I think his message, obviously, he was talking to a domestic audience, but he was also talking to a crushed Hezbollah, a crushed Hamas, and what will be, if we keep it up, a crushed Houthi.
When we come back, the World Deciphered talks with the former National Intelligence Manager for Iran at ODNI, Norm Roule.
And you need to think about these circumstances if you want to understand how Iran sees the world and what it needs to do. It has a possible threat to regime survival by an external power beyond the capacity of its military to oppose. It has a lack of external allies of any strength. Major unrest in the recent era, 2022, a disgruntled population, a poor economy, rising inflation, a need to deflect sanctions pressures, fractures among the great powers.
That's after the break.
You probably already know that the Cipher Brief works with deeply experienced experts on global and national security to help put context around today's headlines. But did you also know that the Cipher Brief produces a daily report that keeps you up to speed on national and global security stories that are impacting businesses around the world? Like the President's Daily Brief, the Cipher Brief's open source report should be your first read of the day to stay ahead of the national and global security stories impacting your world. Become a subscriber and get the report for free. Subscribe at thecipherbrief.com.
Welcome back to the World Deciphered. I'm Suzanne Kelly. Well, Iran is in a much different position at the beginning of the second Trump administration than it was 4 years ago. Israel's war in the Middle East has significantly impacted the ability of Iran's proxies, including Hamas and Hezbollah, to effectively operate. And the issue of a deal that might keep Iran from developing a nuclear weapon is still a front and center issue. I spoke this week with former National Intelligence Manager for Iran at ODNI Norm Roule about how Tehran will likely position itself for Trump 2.0.
Iran is certainly weaker than a year ago, but we need to be careful about using such broad adjectives. Iran's ability to project power is diminished significantly, and it's certainly exposed to further attacks by Israel or the United States. The regime is increasingly unpopular. The economy is poor. So if that's your definition of weakness, then Iran is weak. But just because Iran has lost its proxies and has reduced confidence in its air defenses doesn't mean the regime is about to collapse, or that the West is about to launch sweeping attacks against Iran, or Iran believes those attacks are likely. As a result of the Biden administration's decision not to robustly enforce oil sanctions, the regime now has accessible foreign reserves that are much higher than the estimated $4 billion at the end of the last Trump administration. It will take very, very long-term, very hard sanctions enforcement for some time to reach this low point. The regime may be unpopular, and recent presidential elections an embarrassment, but it still appears relatively stable. Unrest could break out at any time, but at present there is no major protests underway. Security forces appear loyal and relatively resourced. And perhaps most importantly, there is no evidence Iran is yet willing to take steps that would give us confidence that it would accept a deal that would end, if temporarily halt its nuclear weapons and regional ambitions, because doing so would require that it change its own DNA. What do you do with the Quds Force if terrorism and adventurism is constrained? How do you project power and missiles without missiles in the RGC? And last, direct engagement with the U.S. is very politically risky in the regime at present.
Yeah, and I would imagine there's not much of an appetite for that at the current time, but let me know if you feel differently. I'm also interested in learning, what you think Iran has learned from recent negotiations. I mean, it seems like we're in a very different place, as you mentioned, than we were 4 years ago, even. I mean, how do you think Iran is looking at the opportunities ahead of it from its perspective?
That's an important question, because the people in Iran who are working this issue have worked this issue pretty much since 2003. So you have the same people, and they've seen our plays over and over. But they have learned some fundamentals. U.S. pressure can constrain Iran and bring Iran to negotiations if done consistently and over time. There is no question that maximum pressure has done this in various administrations and can do this again if applied correctly. They've also learned that U.S. unilateral sanctions can severely damage the regime. Washington does not need Europe to apply these sanctions. These sanctions slowed the nuclear program, and during periods of maximum pressure under the Trump administration, the previous administration, severely limited resources available to proxies. And I must say that last policy likely saved lives. And when someone says sanctions didn't work, I can assure you they weren't facing Hezbollah missiles. But these policies, unless they're executed consistently with the sense that they won't change with the next administration and have the support of key allies, they won't end aggression. Iran has also learned that it will make concessions when it's faced by diplomatic and economic isolation. It's got to do so. History doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but that dynamic is there. And I think those are important issues.
I think those negotiating terms are going to be very difficult, though, because we do live in a democracy where there's a new administration every 4 years. Unless we see some lifting of presidential term limits in the U.S., that's what's going to happen this time as well. Do you think that the Iranian regime might be taking the wait and see approach that many people had talked about during the first Trump administration?
Well, I don't think it's doing so. In fact, I think it's possible to say right now that Iran has already initiated its playbook for sanctions relief and negotiations. We have seen Europe and Iran engage in talks. This isn't a surprise. This is actually the third time in the last 20 years that Iran has confronted a very similar set of circumstances. And you need to think about these circumstances if you want to understand how Iran sees the world and what it needs to do. It has a possible threat to regime survival by an external power beyond the capacity of its military to oppose. It has a lack of external allies of any strength. Major unrest in the recent era, 2022, a disgruntled population, a poor economy, rising inflation, a need to deflect sanctions pressures, fractures among the great powers. Europe shows a willingness to engage at any moment, and the U.S. is moving towards direct military confrontation if Iran continues its lethal actions against us, but is also looking for a way to avoid a conventional war. If you look at this soup of ingredients, you see similarities in 1999 to 2003, 2009 to 2013, and 2022 to the present. And when that occurred, Iran made substantial nuclear negotiations. It halted the Ahmad weaponization program in 2003 and accepted the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in the Obama eras. I think Iran's going to see if it can run that playbook again, particularly starting with Europe, to see where this goes.
Mm-hmm. Iran has been, as you well know better than I do, Norm, Iran's been trying to develop a nuclear weapon for decades. And it feels like even going back to the early 2000s, there was fear that they were so close to achieving this goal. I'm curious from your perspective, what does Iran need in negotiations in order for any new negotiations to be a good faith effort? What do they need out of them?
Well, Iran's primary goal in negotiations is to fend off the pressure, the diplomatic and economic isolation, and to provide sufficient economic relief to enable the regime to move through a period of time when it's experiencing a leadership transition. We're watching the demise of the revolutionary generation. As the old saw goes, the average age of Iran's revolutionary leaders is deceased. The supreme leader is in his mid-80s, poor health. The next generation is about 20 years younger. Their worldview is not the revolution or the Iran-Iraq war, but the world post-2003. So first, Iran needs to maintain stability. Second, it needs to erode the sanctions pressure and provide some financial relief. But when you look at the nuclear program, Iran has always had 4 red lines or 4 demands that I don't think they're going to change in the near term. No requirement that admit its past weaponization activities. It retains the right to industrial enrichment in its civilian program. It doesn't close nuclear facilities, but it has been willing to dismantle aspects of those facilities. And lastly, the right to continue nuclear research and development. Iran also needs time to revitalize its regional proxies. Can it rebuild Hamas and Hezbollah? It will hope to do so. What can it do to enable the Houthis to expand their influence in the Indian Ocean and East Africa? How do they look at Africa as the next arena for Iran's adventurism? And last, Iran is going to hope to use negotiations, the prospect of negotiations, to put fractures among U.S. policymakers by playing our own politics against itself. So it is true that we need a bipartisan policy. And I have advocated for that, and others have as well. But the reality is developing a bipartisan policy on Iran would take a very long time, and that would only play to Iran's favor. So Iran will seek to work within that dynamic.
I think a bipartisan policy would be particularly challenging for many reasons because of domestic politics at the moment in the U.S. I'm curious, I just want to stick with the negotiation thing for just a moment, and then I want to talk about that younger generation that you mentioned and how you're seeing that generation develop. But will Tehran come to the negotiating table, do you think? And if they do come to the negotiating table, what would you be advising the Trump administration?
Well, as I say, I think they're already looking to come to the negotiating table. Historically, regarding Iran, we've had a situation where there are always back channels, real, imagined, garbled, of individuals or countries who will come to the United States and say, look, I have a contact, a message from Iran saying that they're willing to be reasonable and they're willing to make major concessions. That has been a constant since, frankly, 1979. Every administration has faced that. There are too many people in Washington giving advice to the Trump administration, and I won't go in that direction, but I will make some general comments maybe that would parallel that. I think the administration is doing a good job so far in that it is resetting a posture of international deterrence in its foreign policy that was absent in the previous administration. It has also begun to significantly engage regional allies regional partners on security issues in a way that I think looks where their legitimate security interests parallel ours. The Trump administration is not rushing into an Iran policy, and I think that's very wise. And they need to develop, for example, a China policy that allows for the return of oil sanctions. In the near term, based on history, what would move Iran would be a demonstration of U.S. willingness to use force against any attacks against U.S. persons, the homeland, or the development of nuclear weapons. That's important because if we do that, we stop the IRGC from conducting actions. Now, it's one thing to punish them after an action, but after an action, Iran will justify those actions as to save national face. If you can create that debate now within Iran that you don't want to go there, you're going to have a very bad day, you actually will keep people alive, and it helps the diplomacy. Here, I think we should look at the Houthis, because the Houthis have, unsurprisingly, halted attacks since the inauguration and actually released merchant sailors that they have illegally held for many months. But if attacks against U.S. ships resume, strong military action against Houthi leadership would send a powerful message to Iran's leaders. So, and that I think would signal the U.S. is determined not to waste time. So, what do you need to get there? Well, first, you need a strong intelligence architecture. I cannot overstate this. You need a common intelligence picture with your primary partners. What is the debate within Iran? Where are Houthi leaders? What are they thinking? What is the left and right limits of actions? You need to understand where partners stand through diplomatic engagement. And that's important, although we know some of that. The Trump administration will see, as it did in the past, as other administrations have seen, Europe is unlikely to be a robust partner. It is unlikely to play any role in a pressure campaign against Iran that involves non-economic coercion. It will participate in negotiations. Gulf partners have a limited capacity to support due to their exposure to air attacks in the Houthi challenge. China and Iran will not be partners. As the Trump administration looks at this, I think the weakness, or one of the stated weaknesses of JCPOA was it did not achieve permanent relief from Iran's aggression, but it did provide Iran with, in essence, permanent relief from sanctions. So Iran is going to seek a deal that undermines the entire pressure architecture without committing itself to permanent constraints. Under JCPOA, in 2029 or 2030, Iran would have been able to produce as much 90% enriched uranium as it sought. So I think, maybe in closing, the administration has a big challenge in front of it, and it's called big for big or small for small. So Iran is going to oppose, the grand bargain. It will offer a grand bargain, but a grand bargain that constrains its regional adventurism, that ends its nuclear weaponization efforts, will be opposed because in many ways, this is a justification for elements of the Islamic Republic. The Iranians will refuse to discuss regional or missile issues beyond the basics as they did in 2013. So I was there, and whenever anyone says you should have done this, you should have done that, you pretty much know they weren't there. Iran refused to come to the table at all if missiles or the region was on the table. The regime also knows that normalization brings Western cultural influences. So after 2014, they closed the Pizza Hut after a day, and I think Kentucky Fried Chicken, because these influences fatally undermine the ideological foundations of the regime. So if you go for big, the Iranians must decide first that they're going to change the nature of their regime. The problem is if you go for small, which means they constrain their nuclear program in exchange for the relief of nuclear sanctions, you have a different challenge. First, the Iranians will tell you a week afterwards, look, the deal wasn't popular in Iran. If you pressure us on terrorism, the region, hostages, et cetera, the hardliners will collapse this deal. That's what happened after JCPOA. Second, if you cannot provide nuclear sanctions relief without inherently undermining, to some extent, the broader sanctions structure. And that just relieves the pressure on Iran for these other issues. So in the end of the day, the administration has got to decide how do you start shaping the thinking of the Iranian regime. One issue that might be possible to consider is as the Trump administration moves forward under Keith Kellogg, a very smart and experienced officer, as they move forward on the Russian issue, taking Iran's support for Russia against Ukraine might be a factor that helps you in each area. The 2017 CATSA action, I think it's actions against countries through terrorism. It's North Korea, Iran, and Russia. In essence, says if you're buying a bunch of those weapons, we sanction you severely. I think CATSA may allow some ideological and economic justification for further pressure that could even pull in perhaps Europe. So the Trump administration needs to maybe hurry up but slow down. I think they're doing a pretty good job of doing so.
God, it's incredible, honestly, how complicated this issue is and how many different levers are at play.
Well, Suzanne,
Let me ask you.
that's an important point.
Yeah.
In Washington, there's always, we say there's an answer that is always simple, clear, and wrong. And this is usually done by, we call them the amateurs and dilettantes who say, if you only did this, the world spins in greased grooves.
Right.
Iran is a very complicated challenge, and this has been a challenge for the very smart people in every administration since Jimmy Carter. So we shouldn't expect the Trump administration to perform a miracle overnight, but at the same time, we need to come up with ways to support one more administration as it tackles one of the most complicated challenges in our foreign policy we've had in our country's history.
Yeah. And looking further down the road, Norm, you mentioned that really in order for big change that there would have to be change internally in Iran. How do you see the younger generation playing into this? I mean, you said the average age in Iran is deceased. I mean, it tells you something about where the leadership is and about this rising younger generation. How do you see this playing out over time?
Well, the younger generation has no memory of the Iranian Revolution. Their memory of the Iran-Iraq War is almost negligible as well. I think the average, if you look at a median age or something like that, most Iranians were 3 years old during the Iran-Iraq War. Now, many of them will remember relatives they lost in that conflict, but their worldview is 2003 on. And that's the worldview of Iran's current leadership. They're in their 60s, the early 60s, and they're not going to follow the supreme leader to the grave when he finally kicks off. So this younger generation is looking at the Gulf states who are moving into the 22nd century of social, economic, technological revolution, reform, and liberation. And Iran is still stuck in the 1990s in many ways. That is an inevitable corrosive on the regime. unrest could break out at any time in Iran. It could happen tomorrow. We shouldn't be surprised. But at present, you still see that there are millions of Iranians who oppose the regime. There are some millions who do support the regime, and that's an unpopular fact sometimes to state, but it's a reality. And the largest portion appears to be sitting on the fence and unwilling to take a risk to side with the people pushing the regime. Until the economy maybe erodes a little further, until the regime continues its corruption and nepotism in a way that really upsets the people, you're not going to see, a substantial threat of unrest take place. But we should be careful and have a lot of humility about predicting such things. But the younger generation sees very little justification for the tenets of the Islamic Republic.
Mm-hmm. Norm, I'm going to ask you one more question that's almost like a summary question. And that is, you mentioned that the Trump administration taking a slower approach to developing its Iran policy is actually wise. Why is that? It's difficult for those of us who aren't as steeped in understanding the region as you are to say, why not come out immediately? If you know deterrence works against Iran, why not start pulling some of those levers right away? Why are you advising, or at least saying, it's not such a bad idea to take your time in developing an Iran policy?
Well, as you say, I'm not advising. There's too many of those folk in Washington to come up with the plan for the president, as they call it, or some call it. I think you have to look at, if you're looking at military deterrence against Iran, well, we have a new Secretary of Defense, and what are the plans for our sending aircraft carrier task forces to the Middle East? And why are we doing so? What is the purpose of our current aircraft carrier task force in the Red Sea? It seems right now its primary purpose is to protect Russian and Chinese shipping, because there's not a lot of American shipping in the Red Sea. And the last I checked on the map, the Red Sea was neither next to New York nor Los Angeles. So you've got to have a sense of what are our strategic interests in the Middle East? How do we handle military engagement? What are the prioritizations of the issues we're going to address with our always finite diplomatic bandwidth? How do we begin to establish a China policy in which Iranian oil is going to be a large element? And what do we do with Asian partners who have tolerated the shipment of shadow tankers? How do we handle that in the region? How do we protect our Gulf partners from Iranian missiles and drones, perhaps coming from the Houthis or elsewhere? In some ways, the Iranian issue is fairly easy. And again, I've done this with multiple administrations since 2003. The same questions are asked, pretty much the same answers are given. There's some variations on the time. The solutions for the processes are known, but it's unwise to rush into any of this. And those who may claim that the Trump administration is looking for a conflict, that's obviously not true. Those who complain that the Trump administration is willing to tolerate attacks on the United States, I don't think that's true either. And I think the Colombia incident of yesterday that we've seen, where the Colombian president very injudiciously tested President Trump's resolve, I think sends a powerful message that even in Tehran, people are talking about today, saying, if you test President Trump and his administration, particularly this moment, are they going to respond? And I think for this reason, the Iranians themselves are digesting this new administration, this new world architecture, and how they want to move forward there. Again, going back to intelligence, we need to understand what the Iranians are thinking, feed that into our own machine, and then develop a plan that touches allies, military, sanctions, banking, goodness gracious, diplomatic efforts, et cetera, et cetera.
Something far beyond the sanctions that we've seen that have been used in the past against Iran, that have really in many ways failed to create that deterrence that you believe really needs to be in place.
Suzanne, one point there's sometimes an argument in Washington that sanctions don't work. That's completely untrue. I mean, there's no question. It's open source information. You can measure the impact of sanctions to delay Iran's nuclear program, to impact a variety of different things. But symbolic sanctions don't work. And were I in charge of the world, I would say that when the next time somebody puts forward a proposed sanctions, and we saw plenty of these in the previous administration, there should be a line at the end that says, this is what this sanction will do. Now, in some cases, it just creates an atmosphere, don't do business with Iran, and that's important. But if that's all you do, you're not going to erode capability in Iran and push the leadership into a debate where they make decisions. And it's been a long time since we've imposed sanctions on Iran that have been more than symbolic and shifting the atmosphere. And I'm rigidly nonpartisan, and I've worked for various administrations, but it's hard to, you've really got to go back to the previous Trump administration to see maximum pressure instead of a long list of sanctions that had a questionable impact.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what this new administration, the approach they take to Iran. I know they've got a few other things on the agenda at the moment, but Norm Roule, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here at the Cipher Brief. Once again, it's always just fascinating to understand from you and hear you put context around something that is probably one of the more challenging fronts for U.S. policy moving forward when it comes to Iran. Thank you so much, Norm.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And finally, from the files of the dead drop this week, there was a lot of shuffling at the head of the intelligence agencies last week as those who held senior roles under former President Biden made room for the new picks made by President Trump. The president initially chose the deputy director at ODNI, Dr. Stacey Dixon, to serve in an acting role there, but quickly replaced her. While it was a short stint, she still held the role longer than the CIA acting director, who was only in the job for a couple of days before John Ratcliffe was confirmed by the Senate to serve as director. And there's more insider gossip where that came from. You can check out the full dead drop report every Friday at thecipherbrief.com for a look at what people are whispering about behind the scenes in Washington. Well, that's it for this episode of The World Deciphered. I'm your host, Suzanne Kelly. I'm so pleased to have you with us this week. Thank you for being here. I encourage you to stay up to speed on what's happening Monday through Friday at thecipherbrief.com with our open source report. It is absolutely one of the most comprehensive national and global security reports that you can get each day. It's great to have you once again. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week right here on The World Deciphered.